The following is a presentation of Apologetics Press.
In order for a theory to be true or an idea to be rational, it has to have supporting evidence. The proof that evolutionists generally point to try to substantiate evolution is listed on the screen. In the last two sessions, we examined the first 7 items on the list, and we're seeing that evolution's evidence has been woefully lacking. What about dating methods? According to evolutionists, the scientific techniques that are used to date materials are solid proof of an old Earth and universe, a contention that's in line with evolutionary theory and opposed to the creation model. So is that true? Do dating methods disprove the Bible and support evolutionary theory? The problems with evolutionary dating methods are the assumptions upon which they are based. Scientists and mathematicians have to use assumptions all the time in order to be able to solve problems and figure things out, and assumptions can be fine and good to that end, as long as the assumptions are reasonable and have a small enough effect that the outcome of the problem isn't drastically affected by the assumption. Let's take an example from engineering, a real-world scenario. Let's say I wanted to design a vehicle that'd be for use on a 1-mile strip of road that absolutely nobody uses. It's been blocked off for my use, and I've maintained the road well, repaving it when necessary. I've put up fences that keep animals out of the road. I've taken everything into account to make sure that this road is clear and smooth. Now let's say I wanted to design that car so that it could be remotely controlled from this building where I am. It's equipped with the necessary sensors so that I can determine its velocity and heading at all times. So I start developing the equations that will describe the motion of that vehicle using those sensor readings. And those equations are critical in order for me to know that I'm making the car do what I think I'm making it do, since I'm not going to have cameras on the car to see what's going on. Now, in order to make my equations simpler, I decide I'm going to assume that the vehicle will always have 100% traction, so it's never going to slide from side to side or skid. Well, I check the weather report and I see that skidding conditions are unlikely. So that assumption would probably be a reasonable assumption, one that wouldn't cause significant error in my equations. There may be a few rocks in the road that'll cause a very small amount of error, but by the end of that 1-mile strip of road, I can guarantee with a very high degree of confidence that that car is likely still going to be on the road where I expect it to be. Now let's say I design the same car with the same assumptions for off-road use out in the middle of nowhere with no road, and I want to control the car from here. And I assume there's 100% traction, no skidding or sliding around. How likely is it that I'm going to know exactly where my car is at the end of 1 mile of driving? Very unlikely. Assumptions have to be made in science, but those assumptions have to be made very carefully or the end result will be way off. Invalid assumptions could cause you to draw conclusions that are totally not in harmony with the actual evidence. The problem is that evolutionary dating techniques are based on unreasonable assumptions. For example, uniformitarianism is a fundamental assumption of evolutionary theory and its dating techniques. Ever since James Hutton suggested the idea that the present is the key to the past when examining geological features. The McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms defines uniformitarianism as the concept that the present is the key to the past, the principle that contemporary geologic processes have occurred in the same regular manner and with essentially the same intensity throughout geologic time, and that events of the geologic past can be explained by phenomena observable today. So processes going on today are the same as they were in the past. Without that assumption in place, dating the earth would be impossible. Uniformitarianism is a fundamental assumption in evolutionary dating techniques. But the question is this idea a reasonable approach in dating the earth? Is uniformitarianism a reasonable assumption? Let's consider one example of why it isn't. For years, it's been assumed that the process of petrification is one that takes millions of years to complete. But more and more scientific evidence is coming to light which proves that the rate of petrification can be significantly altered by catastrophic events. For instance, in 2004, 5 Japanese scientists published their research on rapid petrification in the secular evolutionary journal Sedimentary Geology. They were studying mineral-rich acidic water from the explosion crater of the Tateyama volcano in central Japan, water which runs over the edge of the volcano as a waterfall. Some wood had fallen in the path of that mineral-rich water. The surprising discovery was that wood had become petrified with silica after only 36 years as the water flowed over that wood. So they wanted to investigate this phenomenon further. They attached pieces of fresh wood to wire and put them in the water. After only 7 years, the wood had turned to stone, petrified with silica. Wood petrification had occurred due to the nearby volcanic activity as well, and using a powerful microscope, they found that silica petrification occurs in the same way that the wood petrification occurred in the volcanic ash nearby this volcano. Clearly, uniformitarian assumptions when considering geologic phenomena cause major issues when trying to date the Earth and its materials. Catastrophic events can speed processes up and create a superficial appearance of age. Catastrophism, according to the McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms, is the idea that most features in the Earth were produced by the occurrence of sudden, short-lived worldwide events. This approach at interpreting geologic phenomena seems much more reasonable, and this idea is the contention of the creation model. 2 Peter 3:3-6 says, "Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water.'" So Peter discusses individuals who had a uniformitarian mindset towards life, that all things continue as they were from the beginning. And notice that Peter responds to those individuals by pressing the fact that things haven't always moved along in the same way since the beginning. Present events are not a key to the past, as uniformitarianism suggests. Using uniformitarian thinking when viewing life and the earth is not accurate, because it doesn't take into account events which have happened in the past, but which don't happen regularly today, like catastrophic events. Notice that as an example of why uniformitarian thinking isn't accurate, Peter alludes to the greatest catastrophic event ever recorded in history, the global flood of Noah's day. The creation model supports catastrophism as the accurate way to view life and the universe. The creation model doesn't require unreasonable assumptions like uniformitarianism. The creation model accounts for catastrophes that drastically affect any dating schemes attempted by geologists. Granted, the implications of the catastrophic approach to interpreting geology is that there's no way to get an accurate reading of the age of anything very old except through divine revelation. But so be it. If that's where the evidence leads, that's where it leads, and it would be unreasonable to accept any other option not in line with the evidence. The bottom line is that rapid petrification alone disproves the false theory of uniformitarianism. And many other examples could be given to illustrate that uniformitarianism is an unreasonable assumption. Natural catastrophes seriously affect all dating assumptions. Catastrophes like local floods and the global flood of Noah's day, volcanic eruptions, plate tectonics and their effects, especially tectonics possibly caused by God himself on day 3 of the creation week. Who knows what God might have done pre- and post-flood that could have affected the earth's decaying processes? Certainly nobody living today. Actually, once the assumption of uniformitarianism is shown to be inaccurate, the entire grounds for dating the earth as millions of years old falls along with it. The evidence for an old earth simply disappears. Evolutionary dating techniques are built on the assumption of uniformitarianism. According to evolutionists, in order for evolution to be true, the earth and life must be very old, millions of years. The truth is, time won't help. Sit around staring at a rock for millions of years and you can be confident that it won't grow legs and start walking around. But evolutionists still hold to uniformitarianism, and dating techniques have been developed based on that principle to try to date materials from the past. Techniques such as radiometric dating for inorganic materials, carbon dating for organic materials. If these techniques are shown to be invalid, then the entire basis for proving an old Earth crumbles. In an earlier session, I discussed the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The second law indicates that the universe is running down. We're running out of usable energy. Matter itself is breaking down. And scientists have discovered that elements on the periodic table break down or decompose into other elements on the table over time. And the breakdown appears to be at constant rates today. For example, potassium breaks down into argon, uranium into lead, and rubidium into strontium. The starting element's called the parent element, and the element after the decomposition is known as the daughter element. Scientists are able to measure the rate at which the parent isotopes decay into the daughter isotopes with an amazing degree of accuracy. The problem is that dating techniques like these become more and more inaccurate in telling ages the farther back they try to predict age. In other words, they become less and less likely to predict the actual age of a material the older the object appears to be. And one of the reasons evolutionists themselves know this is that when they try to measure the age of, say, a rock using different dating methods, they find that different dating techniques can yield significantly different ages for the same rock, sometimes differing by even millions of years. And one of the primary reasons for this problem is the effect of incorrect assumptions in the dating methods that evolutionists use. As I explained a moment ago, assumptions oftentimes have to be made in science in order to be able to have enough information to solve a problem. However, the key is to make assumptions that are reasonable and that won't significantly corrupt the end result. The problem is that evolutionary dating techniques don't make reasonable assumptions. Evolutionary dating techniques are based on at least 3 specific unreasonable assumptions that do significantly affect the end result, in this case, the age of the item being tested. Take, for example, the uranium-lead dating technique. Uranium decays into lead over time. What are the assumptions that go into getting an age for a piece of uranium? Number 1, the nuclear decay rate of the elements have been constant throughout history. In other words, nothing occurred in history which could have sped up the decay rates over brief periods of time, for example. Number 2, no daughter element existed in the specimen being measured at the beginning of its decay process. In other words, the dating technique assumes that the rock was initially completely composed of the parent element, like uranium in this case. So an assumption about the initial condition of the rock is made. Number 3, the parent and daughter isotopes have not been altered by anything except radioactive decay. In other words, the amount of the elements present in a sample haven't ever been affected by any outside element. So for example, a lava flow didn't occur which could have picked up some of an element from elsewhere and added it to the sample being measured or taken some away, thus corrupting the accuracy of the measurement. Now common sense tells us that these are pretty grandiose, presumptuous assumptions, and the older a rock is, the more time there is for these assumptions to have been violated at some point. Ironically, the dating techniques only worked with a high degree of accuracy for a few thousand years, which is what the creation model postulates for the age of the earth. Let's think about these assumptions for a moment. Are they acceptable? Imagine for a moment that you're walking down the sidewalk and in front of you in the middle of the walk is a pail of water that's halfway filled. And you notice water all around the base of this pail, and you look a little closer along the base of the bucket, you notice there's a small crack that's causing a slow leak. So you decide to do a science experiment to determine if you can find out when this pail was initially filled with water and how long it'll take for this pail to be empty. You take out your trusty ruler and you measure how many inches of water are in this pail. 6 inches, you discover. And then you continue with your walk, and on the way back home, 30 minutes later, you stop and measure the water level again. Now it's 5.5 inches. So you decide this pail is leaking a ½ inch every 30 minutes or 1 inch every hour. You measure the total height of this pail, you find it's 12 inches tall, so you do the math and you're feeling pretty proud of yourself, you feel pretty smart and scientific, and you're able to determine that this pail must have been filled with water 6.5 hours ago and that it'll be empty in another 5.5 hours. But there's problems with your experiment. Little did you know that, number 1, your assumption about the initial condition of the pail was wrong. The pail was initially only 10 inches deep when it was filled 10 hours ago, not 12 inches deep. Number 2, the bucket of water was significantly affected by an outside force. 9 hours ago, a dog came and jumped into the pail, splashing half of that water out, leaving only a quarter of the pail full of water, just 3 inches of water. The force of the dog hitting that bucket caused the leak hole to get bigger, changing the leak rate of the bucket. Then 1 hour ago, the dog's owner came out and filled that pail back to 6.5 inches. You only arrived 30 minutes ago to begin your experiment, at which time the water level was at 6 inches due to the leak. Question: was your experiment a valid experiment, or did the assumptions that you made corrupt the result of your experiment? You assumed the pail was completely filled 6.5 hours ago. In actuality, it was initially only 10 inches deep 10 hours ago, and along the way it was partially refilled. So your experiment was essentially worthless in determining anything, since your assumptions were incorrect. Radiometric dating techniques fall victim to the same fallacies. All three of the aforementioned assumptions have been empirically shown to be unreasonable, and for the same sort of reasons. For example, concerning the first assumption, this is the equivalent of assuming the crack in the bottom of the pail always remained the same size, even though the dog's activity actually caused the crack to expand. Is it reasonable to conclude that the nuclear decay rates of the elements have remained constant throughout history? No, and here is one example of how we know that. A team of geologists known as RATE conducted extensive and notable research on this very idea, investigating the contention that nuclear decay rates have not been constant throughout history. The RATE team studied several zircon crystals from a drilling site in New Mexico. Zircons are considered to be some of the oldest minerals on the earth and are very hard and resistant to deterioration. They're also thought to be able to preserve their contents well, making them safer from contamination. Using evolutionary dating techniques, the crystals were found to be 1.5 billion years old. The problem is that content analysis revealed that large amounts of helium were found to be in these crystals. Within zircon crystals, a portion of the zirconium atoms will be replaced by uranium. As uranium-238 decays into its daughter element, lead-206, alpha particles are released that combine with nearby electrons. Helium is formed, and that helium can be found in zircon crystals. By evolutionary dating techniques, the zircons the RATE team studied revealed billions of years' worth of decay from measuring the amount of daughter products in the crystals, but the helium concentration contradicts that information. Helium is known to behave as a slippery material. Helium atoms are small and are in constant motion as gas particles, so they're hard to contain. They diffuse quickly. Here's the problem. If the rocks were as old as the dating techniques suggest, billions of years old, and if uniformitarianism is true and the current rate of decay for uranium into lead is constant, there shouldn't have been such high concentrations of helium. It should have long been diffused from the crystals and released into the atmosphere. High concentrations of helium are thought to only be sustainable for a few thousand years without significant diffusion. So the presence of high concentration of helium illustrates the fact that at some point or points in the relatively recent past, the nuclear decay rate of uranium was accelerated, producing larger amounts of helium that haven't had time to diffuse yet. So helium concentrations in zircons indicate a young age for the specimen with a period of rapid decay rates, which harmonizes with the creation model, while evolutionary dating techniques indicate an old age with inconsistencies which can't be explained through uniformitarianism. Clearly, the nuclear decay rates of the elements haven't always been what they are today. A global flood in which the fountains of the deep were broken up, surely including the releasing of lava onto the earth, would certainly affect the nuclear decay rates of the elements. Concerning the second assumption, no daughter element existed in the specimen at the beginning of its decay. Comparing our water bucket illustration, this assumption is the equivalent to assuming that that bucket of water was initially completely filled with water. Remember that not only was the bucket not completely filled initially, but at one point water was added back to the bucket, making any assumption about the initial state of the bucket completely worthless. In the same way, common sense tells us that you can't assume that every rock on the earth was initially completely composed of a parent element. How could a person possibly scientifically prove such a thing, and how likely would such an assumption actually be? Parent and daughter elements from totally different sources could easily merge together in a lava flow to make one rock that has parent and daughter elements at the onset of the rock's decay process, and subsequently giving the appearance of age. Again, a global flood in which the fountains of the deep were broken up would certainly contribute to the mixing of elements at the onset of a rock's decay process. Another factor that the bulk of the scientific community wouldn't even consider is that rocks could have initially been created already comprised of a number of elements rather than all parent elements. If so, many things would have immediately had the appearance of age the moment they were created. Yeah, but why would God create something with the appearance of age that isn't actually old? That would be deceptive, wouldn't it? Well, only if you assume that God's motive would have been to create something that looked old solely for the purpose of giving it the appearance of age. But there's a bigger picture to consider. Every aspect of God's creation serves a purpose in the greater workings of the earth, including daughter elements. God might have created daughter elements directly since they were and are an important part of life on earth, not for the purpose of deceiving us, but because of their inherent usefulness. Bottom line, it's quite an assumption to claim that a rock was initially composed only of the parent element. But there are many Bible believers who have bought into the evolutionary propaganda and feel compelled to believe it. As I've mentioned before, you won't get evolution out of a straightforward reading of creation in the account in Genesis chapter 1. Someone had to present information which caused you to distrust the creation account or made you feel pressured to accept evolution. Bible believers who believe in an old earth believe that dating techniques do prove an old age for the universe. That, in turn, causes them to question the account of creation given in Genesis 1. But old earth creationists that have bought into these dating techniques seem to have neglected the fact that God had to initially create the earth with an appearance of age in order for it to be fit for human beings. For example, light from stars that are billions of light years away had to be already in place in order for it to be used for the purposes that God designed for them, for signs, seasons, days, and years, Genesis 1:14. Adam was created with the appearance of being a grown man. The first day he was created, he wasn't a fetus. He was already able to tend the garden, Genesis 2:15, able to understand God's prohibition about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Genesis 2:16 and 17, already able to name the animals, Genesis 2:19 and 20. All of these abilities in spite of the fact that he had just been created. Trees would have already been grown and bearing fruit in order for Adam and Eve to have the nourishment they needed to sustain life. They would likely have had rings in order to be able to support the size of the mature trees, since rings help provide strength as trees get bigger and older. Daughter elements would have likely been present in rocks, since the daughter elements serve purposes on the earth other than showing age. Well, once these things are considered, a fundamental assumption of radiometric dating techniques is totally obliterated. Nothing can be assumed about the initial condition of any rock. So why throw the Bible out or twist it to try to suit naturalistic science? Why not trust the Bible, which is consistent with the evidence? Concerning the third assumption, the item being dated has never been altered by anything except radioactive decay. In other words, this assumption is that we have a closed system on the earth. That's the equivalent of assuming that the pail of water was never affected by anything other than the small leak at the bottom of that pail, rather than realizing that a dog jumped into that bucket of water and water was added back to the pail through the use of a hose. Again, you can see such an assumption is simply unreasonable. To assume that a rock that's being dated has not ever been affected by outside forces throughout its entire existence, no leaching, no water or other substance ever soaked into a specimen and carried off part of an element or added to it, contaminating it. Again, natural catastrophes would certainly affect such an assumption, and such catastrophes are not uncommon today, much less a catastrophe on the scale of the global flood. Without these assumptions in place, the earth can't be dated scientifically, and that bothers many scientists, so they ignore the issues with those assumptions and do the best they can to date an item. But these assumptions totally destroy any attempt to date materials that are very old, because those assumptions simply cannot logically hold. It's simply unscientific to ignore the issues here. The truth is, there has been such catastrophic events over the years that make it impossible to use these techniques to date the earth. The only way to get an age for the earth is through divine revelation. That said, Geology through the lenses of the creation model is a fascinating study, and it's in keeping with the evidence. Much good could be done if geologists would look at the evidence and interpret it in light of biblical statements. The creation model accounts for short-lived catastrophic activity, or like a global flood, as well as local floods and their effects. It accounts for what may have happened to the earth as a result of God's activities on day 3 of the creation week. The earth is said to have initially been covered completely with water, and then in Genesis 1:9, God says on day 3, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." Such a statement would have almost certainly included God raising the seafloor in several areas of the earth so that dry land would appear and so that water would be gathered together. The geological implications of such a statement like that are profound. Magma from under the earth would have likely been exposed from the earth's crust, being raised like that, and major mudslides would have been caused by God's raising the muddy sea bottom above sea level. That would have immediately initiated fossil-forming processes over the next few days. Plant fossilization would have started immediately since plants were created on day 3. Fish and bird fossils would have started forming soon after that on day 5, and then land animals and insect fossils would have started forming due to the mudslides, likely still occurring on day 6. The creation model accounts for the effects of a global deluge, including the formation of valleys and trenches that store much of the water from the flood, possibly alluded to in Psalm 104, 5 through 9, as well as, again, the breaking up of the fountains of the deep. Or what about miraculous Sodom and Gomorrah-like events? God's miraculous activities in the days of old could certainly have affected dating assumptions, events which could have taken place in many parts of the world, but which aren't recorded in the Bible, since the purpose of the Bible isn't to give every detail of God's working in the world throughout history. The Bible is the story of God's love for us as manifested in how He brought Jesus into the world through Adam, Noah, Abraham, and others in order to redeem humanity from thousands of years of sin. It was never intended to be a comprehensive listing of all of God's activities throughout the history of the earth. Who's to say that many of the geologic features of the earth today are not the result of other miraculous, catastrophic activity that God directly engaged in the distant past? Bottom line, the Bible gives plenty of evidence that catastrophism is the appropriate way to view the earth's geologic strata, not uniformitarianism. The Bible believer should have no fear that the scientific evidence will somehow contradict the Bible's teaching. Evolution contradicts the Bible's teaching, but not the scientific evidence. It will never contradict the Bible's teaching. Remember our list of alleged evidences for evolution. All of that supposed evidence, comprising pages and pages of biology and geology textbooks, being thrust upon the minds of young people, causing many to lose faith in the Bible, since the Bible clearly gives a different picture of our beginnings, causing many to totally lose faith in God, accepting atheism instead. A recent Gallup poll illustrated that very point. Over the last 30 years, the percentage of Americans that believe in creation have remained constant, roughly 46%. However, the percentage of Americans who were theistic evolutionists 30 years ago has dropped 6%, and the percentage of Americans who are now secular evolutionists or atheists has increased by the same amount, 6%. That's the equivalent of 19 million Americans. It'd be tragic if it were only one person, but 19 million Americans have become atheistic evolutionists. These Gallup results seem to indicate that the doctrine of theistic evolution is a gateway doctrine that leads many into total faithlessness. Once a person is compromised on the truth of Genesis 1, losing faith in what God clearly stated about the origin of the universe, it's logical that other compromises would inevitably follow, ultimately leading a person further and further away from the God of the Bible, the only source for eternal happiness and peace. But the sad thing, as we've seen in this study, is that there's simply no reason to reject the creation model, as though it's somehow unscientific and can't stand up to the evidence. The evidence indicates that atheistic origin models, Darwinian evolution and the Big Bang Theory, don't pass the science test, while the creation model passes the science test with flying colors. The logical, scientific choice is to simply believe in "Thus saith the Lord." In our final session, we'll wrap up our study of naturalistic evolution and consider the question, if the evidence is so clearly against evolution, why do so many people still believe in it?
This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.